Martin Blevins gripped his first-class boarding pass as he stepped onto Flight 741, bound from Los Angeles to New York. Behind his wire-rimmed glasses, dark circles underlined tired eyes that darted around the spacious cabin, searching for threats only he seemed to perceive. He found his seat, 2C, and let out a shaky breath when the flight attendant offered him a glass of sparkling water. Suddenly, a hush swept across the aisle as a tall, lean older man appeared at the front of the cabin. Martin recognized the unmistakable face of Clint Eastwood, whose mere presence commanded attention without a single word spoken. Martin tried to avert his gaze, but the hush transformed into hushed whispers. Even in a first-class section accustomed to celebrities, Eastwood sparked awe. Martin felt a prick of irritation. He was on edge already, having left behind more than just a job or a bad breakup in Los Angeles. He glanced at the overhead bin where he'd stowed a small black duffel stuffed with more secrets than clothes. "Would you care for a warm towel, sir?" asked a flight attendant. Martin nodded curtly. His nerves were taut, and he could barely muster a polite response. The plane began to taxi, and the tension in his chest grew with each roll of the wheels beneath him. The seatbelt sign blinked off after takeoff, freeing passengers to roam. Eastwood politely greeted a few admirers, offering brief handshakes and a half-smile that was, in its understated way, iconic. Martin feigned indifference. He tried to focus on an in-flight magazine, but each sentence blurred into the next, drowned out by the roaring static of his own anxiety. Minutes later, a flight attendant approached Eastwood with a complimentary beverage. In a moment of awkward coincidence, she then turned to Martin. "Would you like anything, sir?" she asked, smiling wearily. Martin glanced at Eastwood, noting the actor's calm, self-assured posture. Something within him snapped, maybe it was envy, or the crushing weight of his own predicament. "I'm fine," Martin mumbled, voice gruff. Eastwood looked in Martin's direction, polite curiosity crossing his face. That small motion was enough to set Martin off. "What are you staring at?" Martin barked. Gasps rose around them. Even Eastwood looked taken aback, though his expression quickly returned to one of measured calm. The flight attendant's eyes widened. "Sir," she whispered, "please keep your voice down." But Martin's temper, kindled by paranoia, was already aflame. "I'm just tired of this. Hollywood grandstanding," he spat, slumping back against his seat. He could feel the stares of the other passengers, but he refused to meet them. It wasn't even about Eastwood personally. Martin's nerves were shattered, and the actor's confident aura had become an easy target for his frustration. The flight attendant leaned in, voice trembling. "Please, sir, calm down." But Martin just shook his head, regret already forming at the back of his mind. He wanted to shout that he wasn't a bad person. He was just cornered. Yet his harsh words had changed the mood in first class instantly. A few seats away, Eastwood offered a silent nod of acknowledgement, as if to say he wouldn't retaliate. The rest of the cabin, however, bristled. Whispers hummed through the air, a collective anxiety that Martin's outburst had triggered. He sank into his seat, wishing he could reverse the last 30 seconds. This was exactly the kind of attention he couldn't afford. Somewhere in Los Angeles, a past he had tried to bury was stirring to life. And in one careless moment, Martin had just painted a bright red target on his back. As the plane cruised at 35,000 feet, Martin stared at the back of Clint Eastwood's seat. Regret knotted in his stomach like a coiled snake, but there was no undoing his outburst. The cabin lights dimmed for the overnight portion of the flight, leaving him alone with his haunting memories. He tried to close his eyes, but the past crashed in like a tidal wave. He remembered the night he'd driven out to that shabby warehouse on the outskirts of Los Angeles. The place had smelled of stale cigarettes and gasoline. Inside, he had met Carl Fraser, a man with too many connections and not enough morals. It was supposed to be a quick deal, exchanging hush money for a favor Martin couldn't even fully comprehend at the time. Later, Martin learned what the favor truly entailed: covering up the suspicious death of a real estate mogul who had funded Martin's fledgling startup. The official report would call it an accident, but rumors insisted there was a bullet hole in the victim's head. Martin's involvement was murky. He hadn't pulled any trigger, but he'd helped redirect police attention. Guilt and fear conspired to keep him silent. By the time he realized how deep he'd gone, it was too late. Back in first class, he fiddled with the gold wedding band he still wore out of habit. His ex-wife, Sarah, had left him a month after the real estate baron's funeral. She couldn't handle the mounting secrets, the hushed phone calls, the nervous glances at the door. Her final words to him echoed now: "Whatever you're mixed up in, I can't be part of it." Pulling himself from the memory, Martin scanned the cabin. Most of the overhead lights were off, and passengers either slept or watched in-flight movies with headphones. But he felt a stare coming from across the aisle. A man in a tailored suit seemed to be studying him. Their eyes locked for a fraction of a second before the stranger looked away, feigning interest in the seatback menu. Martin's pulse quickened. Did the man recognize him from somewhere? The local news had once run Martin's photo, calling him a person of interest in the mogul's death. Though he'd never been formally charged, public suspicion clung to him like a stain. He rebranded himself, took on freelance tech gigs, and avoided mainstream attention. Fleeing to New York felt like the last chance to outrun the rumors, and maybe outrun Carl Fraser, who had begun demanding more money to keep quiet. He felt sick to his stomach, remembering the hush money he'd paid. Now that he'd antagonized a global icon like Clint Eastwood, a single tweet from any passenger could expose him further. Anxiety churned in his gut. He sipped water, trying to quell the nausea, but it did little to soothe his frayed nerves. In the seat ahead, Eastwood shifted slightly, perhaps reaching for a magazine. Martin averted his gaze. He wasn't sure what possessed him to lash out at the actor. Maybe it was Eastwood's composure, his aura of quiet confidence, that reminded Martin of everything he lacked. Where Eastwood was serene, Martin was a trembling bundle of secrets and lies. Martin closed his eyes again, drifting momentarily into a restless doze. Vague dreams of interrogation rooms and flashing cameras tormented him. When he opened his eyes, the stranger in the suit was gone from his seat. Martin's breath caught. Had the man gone to the restroom, or was he quietly making a call? Maybe speaking to a flight attendant. He thought about the duffel in the overhead compartment, packed with a fake ID, prepaid phone cards, and enough cash to get lost in New York. Yet none of those precautions would matter if the authorities met him at the gate. A single tip-off would be enough. Martin realized, with heart pounding, that he might not make it off this flight a free man. Morning light began to creep through the cabin windows, illuminating the subtle panic etched on Martin's face. He glanced at his watch, only to realize he'd been staring at it for minutes without taking in the time. Sleep had been elusive, broken by half-formed nightmares of police raids and prison cells. Now, with a glimmer of dawn, reality felt no kinder. He noticed the man in the suit had returned to his seat and was talking quietly with a flight attendant. Martin observed the attendant's expression shift from polite neutrality to something more guarded. His skin prickled. "They know," he thought, swallowing hard against the dryness in his throat. Across the aisle, a woman scrolled through her phone. Some flights now offered Wi-Fi, even at altitude. Martin's dread mounted, imagining her Googling Martin Blevins, or searching for unsolved LA murder suspect. He clenched his fists, nails biting into his palms. If word spread among the passengers, a swirl of suspicion could turn into a full-blown confrontation. And Clint Eastwood's presence only added an odd, surreal twist. As if on cue, Eastwood stood, stretching slightly before walking toward the forward lavatory. He moved with quiet poise, not quite the swagger of his movie roles, but enough command to turn a few heads. Martin allowed himself a fleeting curiosity. Did Eastwood have any clue he was seated near a man who might be wanted for murder? The sense of isolation grew. Martin felt like a cornered animal. He weighed his options. Could he feign illness severe enough to force an emergency landing? Risky. Could he duck into the lavatory and attempt to flush any incriminating items? Also risky, and likely fruitless. He had a fake ID, but if someone on the plane already recognized him, it wouldn't matter. He shifted in his seat, trying to look relaxed as the flight attendant made another pass with breakfast menus. When she stopped at Martin's seat, her courteous smile faltered for just a second. "Would you like something to eat, sir?" Her voice was tight, like she was bracing for another outburst. "I'm fine," he replied quickly, eyes locked on her face. She nodded and moved on, exhaling as though relieved. Martin caught a glimpse of the man in the suit discreetly checking his phone. A cold sweat broke across Martin's forehead. He recalled reading about mid-air arrests, where federal air marshals stepped in quietly. Was that happening now? Martin's gaze flicked around the cabin, searching for any sign of an air marshal. No one seemed overtly poised to pounce. Still, the atmosphere felt charged. He considered apologizing to Eastwood, if only to calm the waters. Yet the idea of drawing attention to himself again made his stomach churn. Suddenly, Eastwood re-emerged from the lavatory, pausing near Martin's row to stretch his back. Their eyes met, only briefly, but it was enough for Martin to see a flicker of concern in the actor's gaze. Does he suspect something? Martin wondered. Eastwood's expression was inscrutable, hinting neither judgment nor comfort. As Eastwood returned to his seat, a soft alert chimed. The pilot announced they were cruising over the Midwest and would land in New York on schedule. Martin's thoughts spun. So I have maybe 3 hours until this flight ends. 3 hours until everything unravels. Quiet conversation swelled in the cabin. The business traveler in the suit resumed chatting with the flight attendant, occasionally glancing Martin's way. A faint beep sounded from a phone. The woman across the aisle typed furiously, possibly posting on social media. Martin's paranoia soared, convinced that at any moment, someone would approach him with an accusatory tone. "You're Martin Blevins, aren't you?" He sucked in a shaky breath, trying to quell the rising panic. The flight still had hours to go, but the sense of an impending endgame loomed over him like a storm cloud. He couldn't dodge it forever. The best he could hope for was a chance to slip off the plane unnoticed, but with every passing moment, that possibility felt slimmer. Martin braced himself, fully aware that before the plane's wheels touched down, something dire was bound to happen. The seatbelt sign pinged on with a jolt of turbulence, and the plane shuddered. Breakfast trays rattled, and the flight attendants hurried to secure carts. Martin's heart drummed louder than the overhead storage compartments trembling above him. Each pocket of rough air felt like an omen, as though the plane itself was warning him that his time was up. Suddenly, a man rose from the far side of first class, stumbling toward the aisle. Martin recognized him as the same businessman who had been eyeing him earlier. The man's voice, tight with urgency, carried over the steady roar of the engines. "Flight attendant," he called, and then glanced at Martin. "We need to talk. Now." Martin's breath caught in his throat. The flight attendants tried to calm the businessman, insisting he return to his seat, but the man shook his head vigorously. "I recognize him," he said, pointing a trembling finger at Martin. "He's on the news. Some big case in Los Angeles." "I'm sure of it." A ripple of shock spread through the cabin. Eyes snapped toward Martin. A few passengers gasped. Clint Eastwood, still seated nearby, turned his head, brow furrowing as he processed the accusation. Martin felt cornered, adrenaline spiking. He stood up, arms raised slightly as if to ward off an approaching predator. "You have the wrong guy," Martin insisted, voice shaking. "I'm just trying to get to New York on business." Turbulence struck again, nearly knocking the businessman off his feet. One flight attendant hurried to steady him, while another stepped between him and Martin. "Sir, please," she said, voice strained. "We can't have any confrontations. Let's all remain seated." But the words did nothing to quell the electric atmosphere. The businessman's face reddened with determination. "I saw an article last month. There's a photo of this guy. He's wanted for questioning about a homicide." Martin's vision tunneled, every sense focused on the immediate threat. He could see fear in the eyes of other passengers, and condemnation. He needed to do something, anything, before this spiraled further. In a surge of desperation, he pushed past the flight attendant, making a move toward the front of the plane. If he could just talk to the pilot, request an emergency landing. Clint Eastwood rose as well, calm but resolute, stepping into Martin's path. He didn't say a word, he simply placed a hand on Martin's shoulder, meeting his gaze with a level stare. It was that iconic, understated presence, the same one that had captivated audiences for decades. Yet Martin was too far gone. Panic had overwhelmed logic. "I'm not a killer," Martin exclaimed, voice cracking. I just..." Words failed him as the plane jerked again, sending another shudder through the cabin. A flight attendant grabbed the intercom. "Captain, we have a situation in first class." Requesting, Martin's eyes darted to the emergency exit. He knew opening it mid-flight was impossible and lethal. Still, the sight of it triggered a wild thought: better to risk everything than face certain arrest. Eastwood's grip tightened slightly, a silent warning. "Don't do anything foolish," Eastwood said, his voice low and firm. The businessman advanced once more. "I want to see the captain. He's a fugitive." Passengers shifted in their seats, some frightened, others openly recording on their phones. The tension felt poised to snap. The plane rattled with renewed turbulence, cabin lights flickering. Martin felt trapped in a nightmare, no way out, no place to hide from the collective gaze. A flight attendant tried to usher the businessman back, while another attempted to calm Martin. But the tide had turned. Everyone in first class was either suspicious of Martin or terrified. Realizing he had no control, Martin sagged in Eastwood's grip, tears burning in his eyes. He'd spent so long running from the consequences of that night in the warehouse, only to find himself on a flight with nowhere to go. "I'm not a bad person," Martin whispered, swallowing a sob. Eastwood's gaze softened, just slightly. "Then let's land," the actor replied quietly, "and sort this out." With that, Martin felt the last shred of denial slip away. Whatever happened next, he couldn't outrun fate any longer. The final hour of Flight 741 felt like the longest of Martin's life. He remained in his seat, flanked by two concerned flight attendants who insisted he stay put until landing. The businessman hovered near the front galley, arms folded, watching Martin like a hawk. Clint Eastwood had returned to his own seat but kept a watchful eye on the situation, saying little to avoid further escalating the chaos. When the captain's voice crackled over the intercom announcing their descent into JFK Airport, Martin's stomach twisted into a knot. Outside the window, the skyline of New York was visible against a pale morning sky. Instead of the usual rush of excitement travelers feel when catching sight of a new city, Martin felt only dread. As the plane dipped lower, the flight attendants made their final safety checks. Martin glanced at his overhead bag, his duffel of secrets. He doubted he'd ever see it again once they landed. He didn't even try to retrieve it, the futility was crystal clear. Nearby, Eastwood met Martin's gaze with a subdued nod, a quiet acknowledgement that the end of this tense journey was near. The tires screeched against the runway, and the engines roared in reverse thrust. The cabin jolted slightly, and a collective exhale whispered through the airplane. Martin's heart pounded so fiercely, he wondered if others could hear it. He recalled every choice that led him here, every bribe, every lie, every anxious night. He wasn't sure if he truly deserved freedom anymore. Once the plane taxied to the gate and the seatbelt sign blinked off, the flight attendants instructed passengers to remain seated momentarily. Martin watched in resignation as two uniformed police officers stepped on board. Their expressions were resolute, scanning the cabin until they locked eyes with him. "Martin Blevins?" one officer asked, voice echoing in the silent aircraft. Martin nodded numbly. As the officers approached, the businessman from earlier seemed almost triumphant, though a flicker of empathy crossed his face. Nearby passengers, including Eastwood, remained respectfully quiet, allowing the scene to play out without further spectacle. Martin stood, hands raised in a gesture of surrender. The officers read him his rights as they guided him into the jet bridge. Each step felt heavy, like trudging through wet sand. Behind him, he heard the whispered chatter of passengers finally free to disembark. A part of him wanted to turn back, to say "I'm sorry" one last time to the entire cabin, or to Eastwood, whose presence had become an odd focal point of Martin's downfall. Once inside the terminal, Martin was led to a small security office where officers removed his personal belongings and asked him to wait. The airline staff provided statements about his mid-flight behavior, while a detective from the Port Authority arrived with a thick file in hand. It seemed the Los Angeles investigation had officially caught up to him. After hours of questioning, Martin confessed to withholding information about the real estate mogul's death. He confessed to the hush money, to the half-truths, and to running across state lines out of pure fear. Tears slipped down his cheeks when he admitted he never wanted anyone killed. He'd just been desperate, manipulated by men like Carl Fraser. Clint Eastwood's involvement became a sensational headline: "Fugitive suspect arrested on flight with film legend." News outlets relished the bizarre coincidence. Yet to Martin, the celebrity angle was the least of his concerns. He was left pondering how a single impulsive insult could unravel every last attempt to stay hidden. Later that evening, as Martin waited for transport to a holding facility, he felt a strange kind of relief. No more running. No more paranoia. The facade was gone, replaced by the cold reality of legal consequences. He couldn't predict how severe his sentencing might be, but in that quiet moment, he almost welcomed the truth. At least now, he didn't have to look over his shoulder every waking second. The next day, from the back of a police cruiser, Martin glimpsed a newspaper kiosk bearing a headline about his arrest. Though he couldn't see the full article, he caught the name Eastwood in bold print. "Man insults Clint Eastwood on a first-class flight, instantly regrets it when the truth is revealed." Indeed, the truth had finally come. And with it came a new chapter of Martin Blevins' life, a chapter he never could have scripted but one he might, in some distant future, find a way to accept.